Hello and welcome to this, our 2024 Simpson Hewitt-Lecture. The Simpson Hewitt-Lecture is one of two endowed lectureships that take place by virtue of Andover Newton Seminary's presence at Yale Divinity School. In the spring, we'll have our Bauer-Broholm lecture, which is it's always on the topic of faith and work, faith at work. And the speaker for that event will also be here celebrating Newton Theological Institute's bicentennial. Her name is Gina Jacobs-Strain, and she is the executive leader of the American Baptist Churches USA. So, this endowed lecture, the Simpson Hewitt Lecture, is always and forever on the topic of the history of congregationalism. And we've had a number of outstanding, esteemed scholars create and present original scholarship for the Simpson Hewitt Lecture. On our very own faculty, we've had a lecture from Tisa Wenger on the topic of what might be the ethics of commemorating the bicentennial of the Hawaii mission on the part of congregationalism, congregationalist ministers. We had Marilyn Robinson talk about the way in which congregational ministers in her fiction writing were informed by her understanding of the history of congregationalism. And tonight, this evening, we have a lecture from our very own Emmanuel Akyeampong, who will be introduced by Professor Markheim in just a moment. We're so grateful that you're here to learn about the history of congregational ministry and congregationalism as a movement, a history that does not risk becoming lost because we live it out in the way we make community here today and in the settings where our graduates go on to live into their calling and serve in the congregations. Would you pray with me? Holy God, we give you thanks for the Simpson Hewitt Lecture, for all of the new knowledge that's been created in order that it might be shared through this lecture tradition. We give you thanks for all who have shared their wisdom in the past, and tonight we give thanks for our sibling, Emmanuel. We give you thanks that he's here. We give you thanks that he is who you created him to be, and that Andover Newton has been part of his journey as a person of faith and as a minister and as a scholar. I give you thanks, God, for all the people who have gathered together and who will experience the recording of this lecture, that they might find something in it that tells them just a little something more about God and about your love for us, God. All this I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. And welcome.
Well, it's my great pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce to you Emmanuel Akyeampong, who was our lecturer this evening. He is the Ellen Gurney Professor of History and Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. He is also the Minister for Worship and Formation at the Memorial Church at Harvard. And we were talking a little bit before we started here about having these two different roles in Harvard University is interesting, to be a pastor and a professor. And I think it's wonderful for us at Andover Newton to think about uniting faith and learning head and heart, that we couldn't really have a better example than we do in Emmanuel. One very clever way of having reputation for producing eminent students is to have students who are eminent before they come to your institution. And in this case, this was certainly true. Emmanuel received his bachelor's degree in history and religions from the University of Ghana in 1984, a master's degree from Wake Forest University in North Carolina in 1989, his Ph.D. in African history from the University of Virginia in 1993, and he's been at Harvard really ever since 1993, but he crowned his educational achievements by receiving a Master of Divinity from Andover Newton in 2014. So we kind of joined that train when it was pretty far along, but it was really a blessing for us. As a former chair of the department, the Committee on African Studies, really at Harvard, he, along with Professor Henry Louis Gates, have been instrumental in creating the program of study in African American Studies and African Studies at Harvard. and he is one of the co-editors, along with Professor Gates, of the African Biography 6-volume series, which is really a landmark in the study of African history. He's written a number of books. I won't tell you all of them. One of the more recent ones is Independent Africa, the First Generation of Nation Builders, published in 2023, and a book I think is a particularly notable title, though I've not read the book, the book is called Drink, Power, and Cultural Change, A Social History of Alcohol in Ghana, 1800 to Present Times. He's been awarded numbers of honors and honorary degrees. He is a corresponding member of the Royal Historical Society, belongs to the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences. But for all those of us who know him and Andover Newton and since, I think alongside these scholarly achievements, what we know and value and appreciate most about Emmanuel is his sweet pastoral spirit, his very warm heart for the gospel, and his incredible facility in serving alongside those who are, whether they are students or fellow colleagues. So we welcome you with great joy, returning to one of your alma maters here, and look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Sarah, for the invitation. Thank you, Mark, for the wonderful introduction. Thank you all for coming. And in my acknowledgements, I also want to acknowledge William McCarthy, who was my co-researcher at the Congregational Library and Archive. I think he was probably intrigued by why this African is interested in the kinds of questions, and he found me all kinds of things. So I'm very grateful. I thought I would just give you an outline so that you know where I'm taking you. I was told not to speak more than 35 minutes, at most 40. I have agreed to Mark's request that I can answer questions, so that should be fine. So as I go ahead, I will move the slides along for you to be able to keep pace with me. I have a few images I would like to share, and I believe this is a lecture that is written to be read, so I hope you enjoy it. I was born in Ghana, West Africa, in the early 1960s, and grew up in the Presbyterian Church of Ghana. My first encounter with the United Church of Christ, or the UCC, or Congregational Church, was in Massachusetts in the mid-1990s, after I had moved there to take up an academic position at Harvard University. In 2011, I enrolled in the MDiv program at Andover Newton Theological School, which was then in Newton, Massachusetts. I was taught systematic theology by Mark Heim, partnered by Andrew Armstrong, then senior minister of Acton Congregational Church. When my time came for field education, I asked Reverend Armstrong if I could do field education at his church, and he agreed. As I completed the MDiv, I had yet to make a decision on which denomination to choose for ordination. Reverend Armstrong encouraged me to take a polity class on the UCC. You'll be surprised what you find. It is a big tent and can accommodate your faith journey, he told me. I enrolled in the UCC polity class at ANS in 2014. In our readings, I discovered that in the 1980s, the UCC Synod passed several resolutions and pronouncements on the apartheid system in South Africa, advocating divestment of all financial resources from all corporations doing business in South Africa, and for corporate responsibility regarding South Africa. Broad statements on racial and economic justice from that decade reflected the denomination's investment in social justice. I became curious about what in the institutional DNA or church code of the denomination explained these values or traditions, and why its strong interest in South Africa. The invitation to give the Simpson Hewitt-Lecture offered an opportunity to revisit this discovery from my polity class and to understand the relationship of the UCC or Congregational Church to South Africa. This lecture brings together my training as a theologian and as a historian of Christianity in Africa. My research introduced me to the American Zulu Mission. So let me make sure I'm on my introduction. An initiative of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, hereafter the American Board, which had been chartered in 1812 as the first American Missionary Society. The early supporters of the American Board were mostly Congregationalists. Within a decade of its establishment, the American Board had launched a mission to Native Americans, and its missionaries were present overseas in India, Ceylon, the Hawaiian Islands, the Ottoman Empire, and Persia. In the 1830s, the board turns its attention to Africa and selected Liberia, the product of the American Colonization Society and settled by free African Americans, and the port of Natal in the southeastern coast of present-day South Africa as their points of entry. From the late 19th century, the board's missionaries became active in Johannesburg as numerous gold mines were opened on the Rand, and Johannesburg became a magnet for migrant workers from all over Southern Africa. This was the context for Ray and Dora Phillips, American board missionaries who worked in South Africa, mainly in Johannesburg from 1918 through 1959. They were witnesses to increasing segregation and the introduction of apartheid in South Africa. Both products of Carleton College in Minnesota, an institution founded by the Congregational Church, the Phillipses were active proponents of the social gospel of Jesus and doing social work in South Africa. In Johannesburg, Ray Phillips was central in the opening of recreational or social opportunities for indigenous Africans, or the Bantu, as they were called. Sports, debating and literary clubs, cinema, concerts, and so on. Out of this will come institutions like the Gamma Sigma Club in 1920, the Bantu Men's Social Center in 1924, the South African Institute of Race Relations, 1929, and the Jan Hofmeyr School of Social Work in 1941, institutions that touched many who would become leaders of Southern Africa's liberation movements. Ray Phillips was a white liberal whose writings on African women has been criticized by gender scholars as providing a basis for apartheid policies that discriminated against urban African women. I do not dispute that, but reading his correspondence with an extensive network of Southern Africans who had crossed paths with him or sought his help after he had left South Africa, it is impossible to dismiss Ray Phillips' impact on educated Black Southern Africans. That liberation movement leaders like Winnie Madikizela Mandela of South Africa, Eduardo Mondlane of Mozambique, and the Zimbabwean Joshua Nkomo were products of the Jan Hofmeyr School of Social Work is truly significant. Leaders of the ANC, like the Sisulus and the Mandelas, had their wedding receptions at the Bantu Men's Social Center in Johannesburg. Musicians like Hugh Masekela, Miriam Makeba, and Jonas Gwangwa, who later became international ambassadors for the anti-apartheid movement, played some of their first concerts to mixed audiences at the Bantu Men's Social Center. Indeed, I would argue that principles or values like the ANC's attachment to multiracialism and constitutionalism emerge from relations and their experience with white liberals like Ray Phillips. The work of Ray Phillips would convince many black Africans, from miners to the educated elite, that they could even work with some white South Africans. In 1959, a section of the ANC broke away under Robert Sobukwe to create the Pan-Africanist Congress, which, unlike the ANC, insisted on only black membership. Mandela's Rainbow Nation has deep roots. Albie Sachs, writer of Oliver Tambo's Dream, a book, or The Vision, points out that Oliver Tambo's dream, or vision, for a free South Africa was one that conjoined majority rule in a non-racial democracy with an emancipatory pro-people Bill of Rights that put at its center the interests of the dispossessed. The longest-serving president of the ANC from 1969 to 1991, Tambo, a lawyer and partner of a law firm with Mandela in Johannesburg before the ANC was proscribed, and those who inherited Tambo's vision, considered the new constitution for the transition to a non-racial democracy the instrument to ensure a just and fair society. The South African Constitution of 1996, which came into effect in February 1997, has been considered one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. In his book, The Bantu Are Coming, published in 1930, Ray Phillips opined, and I quote him, "Black and white interests in this country are identical. The improvement of either means the improvement of both. The choice is still open. South African whites can keep the cover of repression tight on until it is blown off through revolution. Or they can provide ways and means for providing legitimate avenues of endeavor for black and white alike, and guarantee a future which will contain elements of hope for all." I move to the section on the American Zulu mission and Ray and Dora Phillips. In the 1830s, the American board decided to extend its work overseas among non-Europeans to Africa. They settled on Liberia and South Africa. The first because of African American settlers who sought to create a new free society under the auspices of the American Colonization Society. South Africa because these European settlers and British rule in the Cape Province promised some security and support. New England was well represented among the early missionaries that embarked on the American Zulu mission in 1834. Of the missionaries that headed to Natal, Alden Grout of Massachusetts and George Champion of Connecticut had trained at Andover Theological Seminary. Grout's wife, Charlotte Bailey Grout, was a graduate of Mount Holyoke Seminary in Massachusetts. Mount Holyoke became a fertile ground for spouses for missionaries of the American Board, which encouraged male missionaries to marry before embarking on mission trips overseas. Single women who were graduates from Mount Holyoke also enlisted as missionaries of the American Board. And Healy Clancy commented that by the late 1880s, over a fifth of all American Board women came from Mount Holyoke. These New England institutions shaped the educational evangelical mission and vision of the missionaries in the American Zulu Mission. When the American Board established Inanda Seminary for Girls in Natal in 1869, it was envisioned as a Southern African version of Mount Holyoke. Graduates of Inanda Seminary would marry products of the American Board's male seminary in Natal, Amanzimtoti Institute, founded in 1853 to train pastors. In the 1890s, two American Board missionaries arrived in South Africa who would become active proponents of the social gospel that developed among Protestant churches in Britain and the United Kingdom, in Britain and the United States from the 1880s. Herbert Goodenough in 1894 and Frederick Bridgman in 1898. Johannesburg would become an important site of missionary work for the American Board. In the 1880s, gold had been discovered on the Witwatersrand, also referred to as the Rand or the Reef, starting a gold rush to the Transvaal Republic. The profitability of gold mining, because of the low-grade nature of gold finds, turned on cheap labor. And by the turn of the 20th century, the mines had put in place an extensive labor recruitment system that brought migrant workers from the entire region of Southern Africa. The American Board missionaries came to Johannesburg to work among African migrants and the African families emerging on the Rand. Frederick Brainerd Bridgman, whose work with his wife, Clara Davis Bridgman, would be celebrated on the Rand, was not new to South Africa. Frederick Bridgman's parents, Henry Martin Bridgman and Laura Bridgman, were part of the American Zulu mission in Natal. His son, Frederick, was born and grew up in Natal. It was Frederick Bridgman who recruited Ray and Dora Phillips to come and assist in the American Board's work in Johannesburg. So these are the Ray and Dora Phillips. Bridgman, before he returned to South Africa as a missionary for the American Board, had worked after graduating from Oberlin College as a secretary of the YMCA. The board first sent Bridgman to the Zulu Mission in Natal, where he grew up, and then posted him to Johannesburg in 1916. In charge of the churches and schools in the mines and cities of the Witwatersrand, he was struck by the absence of organized social and recreational life for Africans. He came up with a vision of what would become the Bantu Men's Social Center, as Ray Phillips recounted several decades later. So let me quote from Ray Phillips. With his YMCA background, Dr. Bridgman quickly sensed the need for recreational and leisure time activities, in addition to the religious and educational work which was in charge of. So convinced was he of this that when he came to the USA on Fellow about 1917, he raised $40,000 to start social work in Johannesburg, intending that some of this at least should be used to begin work of a YMCA nature. Mrs. Phillips and I were asked to come to South Africa to help Bridgman get things started and start a YMCA when it was built. I had had training in the working of the YMCA and was glad to undertake this work. Quotation closed. Ray and Dora Phillips arrived in South Africa in 1918, and after a short period in the Natal province, who spent the next 4 decades as residents of Johannesburg and at the center of interracial relations. So let me move to the next section. Ray Phillips immediately sized up the enormous potential for missionary and social work in Johannesburg, not just among South Africans, but for the entire sub-region, because of the regional nature of labor migration. I quote him, "How strategic is Johannesburg for reaching and for good the young men of the whole African subcontinent? These young men will return home at the end of the year of work at the mines. Many will go back to heathen villages in far corners of the land, where perhaps white man's face has never been seen." Quotation closed. Rural immiseration and scarce land in the countryside of Southern Africa, a product of white settlement and land appropriation, together with new material demands, and the imposition of colonial taxes pushed Africans in the region to come and work in the gold mines on the Rand. In The Bantu in the City, published in 1938, based on Ray Phillips's Ph.D. dissertation from Yale University, Phillips drew on a range of social, economic, and health statistics in his anatomy of the Bantu condition on the Rand. His understanding of the political economy was astute, and the social science approach in the dissertation sets the Bantu in the City apart from his first book, The Bantu Are Coming, published in 1930. While Phillips saw the major problems posed by inadequate wages, single male migration, poor housing, women in the towns and illicit liquor trade and prostitution, the rise of crime and delinquency, and other features of rapid urbanization aggravated by racial segregation. He also viewed African presence on the Rand as a great potential for missionization and the broadcasting of the gospel as labor migrants to Johannesburg returned home with the gospel. Johannesburg's African population had grown from 15,000 in 1890 to 307,000 in 1937. Equally present for Phillips were the tens of thousands of black Africans who were making permanent homes in Johannesburg. The labor migrants to the mines were usually housed in mining compounds, which were single male residential facilities. African families in Johannesburg by the 1930s had been directed to 4 designated native locations or townships. According to the 1936 census, over 100,000 Africans had made Johannesburg their permanent home. This was a significant mission field. Phillips was worried about 2 social forces at work among Africans on the Rand: the hold of heathenism and the pull of communism. It is not coincidental that the first chapter of The Bantu Are Coming is entitled A Glimpse of Heathendom and narrates a visit by Ray Phillips, Howard Caitlin, and their African guide Lukimbi to a rural village. When they arrived, the chief of the village was sick, and they had called what would be translated a witch doctor or a sangoma to come and divine who was causing this illness. Phillips will opine, a fear cloud covers heathen Africa. Witchcraft blots out the sun. For Phillips, there was equally the present danger that African migrants to the city who managed to shake off the hold of heathenism might embrace communism and become what he termed heathen materialists. He noted the failure of the Christian church to protect the vulnerable and the disempowered in South Africa. How the communist agitator can claim with some truth that, I quote him, the God of the missionary provides you with good things after you are dead. Phillips queries, has Christianity anything to say in answer to the swaggering, sweeping claims of communism? For Ray Phillips, the problem lay in the antiquated theology of the Christian church in South Africa. Let me quote him. Here, however, the cause can, I think, be traced to the door of an antiquated theological viewpoint. The older evangelical position, which stresses individual salvation exclusively and ignores the social application of the Christian gospel. Quotation close. Racial exploitation and oppression in South Africa and America had railroaded the Christian message as dominant whites strove for convenient and comfortable positions that upheld the gospel but turned a blind eye to the social suffering of millions of blacks disadvantaged by the structural inequities of a skewed, racialized political economy. parallel theological dilemmas emerged in the racially hierarchical societies of the United States and South Africa. In the United States in the mid-20th century, black theologians distinguished between slave Christianity and the slaveholders' Christianity by underscoring how slave Christianity emphasized the historical Jesus and his liberating work among the marginalized and vulnerable, while slave-holding Christianity pointed to the incarnate Christ and his saving work on the cross. Liberation and black theologians in the 1960s and 1970s would make bold and important claims about a black Christ who related to the condition and concerns of African Americans. In South Africa, about the same time, the black theologian and pastor Alan Bosak would concur as he stressed that, and I quote him, "The sober truth is, for black Christians in South Africa today, relevant preaching is ethical preaching. More precisely, political preaching." In his years in Johannesburg, Ray Phillips went about the arduous task of building networks and institutions that would translate the social gospel into reality. We turn to these institutions and the impact they would have on Southern Africans, black, colored, Indian, and white. In his 4 decades in Johannesburg, Ray Phillips established several institutions that provided opportunities for sports, social activity, interaction between black and white South Africans, the conduct of scientific research on black life in South Africa, and the training of social workers. The key institutions included the Gamma Sigma Clubs, the Bantu Men's Social Center, the South African Institute of Race Relations, and the Jan Hofmeyr School of Social Work. Before I examine these key interventions, let me briefly address the sources of inspiration for the work of Ray Phillips. I reference 2 pivotal developments at the turn of the 20th century in the Church's understanding of its commitment to the working classes and the socially vulnerable in developed countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, transformed by industrialization and urbanization, and the extension of these processes to Africa and Asia through European colonial rule and its impact on indigenous peoples. Capitalist exploitation of workers and the social and economic condition of the working classes grated on Christian sensibilities. Walter Rauschenbusch, a minister in the Second German Baptist Church in the New York City in the 1880s, witnessed firsthand the social problems of depressed neighborhoods. He would be at the center of the social gospel movement launched in the 1880s and provided an articulate framework for the movement in his influential book, Christianity and the Social Crisis, in 1907. The social gospel movement pointed to the work of the historical Jesus in our historical time. For Rauschenbusch, it was crucial that the spiritual force of Christianity be, I quote him, be turned against the materialism and the mammonism of our industrial and social order. This was a powerful vision, and Rauschenbusch saw the work of organizations like the YMCA, the YWCA, and the Salvation Army as pioneers of the work to come. In the late 1920s, as the influence of the social gospel movement declined in the United States, the report of the International Missionary Council meeting in Jerusalem in 1928 put fresh wind in the sail of the Social Gospel International. It is instructive that Phillips reproduced the entire report as an appendix in the Bantu Are Coming, with the permission of the International Missionary Council. The report was particularly concerned with the unfolding ravages of capitalist investment and industrial activity among non-Western peoples in colonized areas. The report noted that it is the duty of the Church to speak and work fearlessly against social and economic injustice. The report conceded that the Christian Church had failed in this. Sections of the report read like the authors had South Africa in mind. Like Rauschenbusch's influential Christianity and the Social Crisis, the Jerusalem Report ends on the importance of research on how Christian bodies in the mission field and in Europe and America must equip themselves to conduct economic and social research and to produce reports on, I quote them, the economic and social problems arising from the contact between the more advanced civilizations and the peoples of underdeveloped countries. Quotation closed. Phillips and other missionaries came together to create the first Gamma Sigma Club in Johannesburg in 1920, a small debating and literary society for natives. Aware of the frustration and anger of black Africans in Johannesburg, Phillips arranged for white city officials to come and speak to the club. A bridge for interracial dialogue was built in the heart of Johannesburg. The affairs of the Gamma Sigma Club and other recreational activities among men and youth suggested the need for a social center. I mentioned earlier how Bridgman raised funds from the United States in 1917 with the intention of opening a YMCA-like center in Johannesburg. He recruited Ray Phillips to come and assist with this endeavor, both having worked with the YMCA in America. But the YMCA rebuffed Bridgman and Phillips when they approached them about opening a branch for Africans in Johannesburg. I quote Phillips. When, however, in 1919, Dr. Bridgman and I approached the National Council of the YMCA in South Africa, we were met with a blank refusal to allow us to put up a building to be called a YMCA. The objection was that the starting of a YMCA for Africans would cheapen the name YMCA for European lads. If Africans were to be admitted to the Y, it would make their work harder among the white lads. Quotation closed. After consulting several friends in the city, Bridgman and Phillips decided to proceed with their plan of building a social center anyway. They received support from individual members of the National Council of the YMCA. The Johannesburg Chamber of Commerce and the Native Recruiting Corporation expressed enthusiasm, and the City Council generously offered land for the building and subsequently gave them an annual grant. The building for the Bantu Men's Social Center was completed in 1924. So this is it. For several decades, this was the center of African social life in Johannesburg. With the ascendancy of the National Party in 1948 and the increasingly rigid implementation of apartheid, the Bantu Men's Social Center, located in what had come to be declared European space by the Group Areas Act, was put on notice in 1964. After some years of liminality, it was closed down on December 31st, 1971. Historian of South Africa, Iris Berger, points to how the South African Institute of Race Relations was founded in a meeting at the home of the Phillipses in 1929. A novel coalition of professionals and representatives of South African business. It aimed to conduct scientific research into the social and economic conditions of non-European populations of Southern Africa and to promote racial cooperation. Phillips's second book, The Bantu in the City, based on his doctoral dissertation from Yale University, is modeled after the social science approach advocated by the South African Institute of Race Relations. Perhaps the most important social intervention of Ray Phillips in Johannesburg was his establishment of the Jan Hofmeyr School of Social Work in 1941, the first school for social work for South Africans in the country. Named after a liberal minister in the government of Jan Smuts, the school would gain enormous prestige for its work and establish social work as an important profession for Southern Africans. Initially housed in the same building with the Bantu Men's Social Center, the Jan Hofmeyr School moved to a new location in the Johannesburg Municipal Building in 1947. By 1950, a third of the Hofmeyr School's 108 graduates were women. So this is from the Phillips files. It's not as clear, but you can see the mixed gender composition. Iris Berger speaks to the prestige of the school among Africans, and I quote Iris. The school also had high prestige with the African community, offering one of the few professional opportunities for Africans, male or female. Despite the apolitical attitudes, white liberal leadership, and government financial sponsorship, Nelson Mandela, then a young lawyer and leader of the ANC, numbered among its patrons, and many Hofmeyr students were reputed to be members or supporters of the ANC, which came to the forefront of political life in the early 1950s through its militant campaign of nonviolent resistance, quotation closed. The Hofmeyr School will also fall foul of the apartheid government's Group Areas Act, with its location in central Johannesburg, and the government's reconceptualization of tertiary education for non-Europeans. The Hofmeyr School was forced to close in 1959. In her incisive article on Ray Phillips's representation of urban women in South Africa, Iris Berger points to how Phillips's published works, especially his monographs, The Bantu Are Coming and The Bantu in the City, provided fodder for the apartheid legislation against African women by denying them a legitimate place in the city. She notes correctly that despite the Ph.D. from Yale around 1937 and the social science approach in the dissertation that became The Bantu in the City, the conclusions of this book were not different from Phillips's first book, The Bantu Are Coming. Both emphasize moral solutions. Berger points to how the curriculum at the Hofmeyr School was apolitical, and I quote her, largely practical and moralistic. These are accurate criticisms, but we must remember that Ray Phillips was a missionary, and as an advocate of the social gospel, he would agree with Rauschenbusch that the most pressing issues of their day was that of public morality. Phillips sought to build racial bridges, not aggravate racial tensions. But to be apolitical in his approach to race relations did not mean that Phillips lacked a political vision. In the concluding chapter to The Bantu Are Coming, Phillips observed, let me quote him, 140 million black folk in Africa, 2 million white, 1 white to 70 blacks. It is inevitable that this overwhelming black population shall eventually control the affairs of the African continent. It is inevitable that only those people of other races shall find permanent place in the future destiny of Africa, who have learned to get along in brotherly fashion with men of color. Quotation closed. Through his work, Phillips sought to facilitate brotherly relations across the races. He was eager to equip Africans with higher education and professions, to bring them into dialogue with informed whites in business and professional circles, seeing this collaboration as Africa's future. And Africans who came under his influence were in no doubt about the sincerity of his vision, And back in the United States, after retiring from South Africa, Phillips closely monitored the political situation in Southern Africa. We turn to the influence of Phillips and Congregationalism on Southern Africa's liberation movements. I'm coming to a close. I have read works on the importance of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, on black liberation struggles in South Africa and Zimbabwe. But I must confess that before my research for this paper, I had not envisioned a similar role for Congregationalism. So I was suitably impressed that 3 prominent leaders in liberation movements in 3 Southern African countries had attended the Jan Hofmeyr School of Social Work. Winnie Madikizela Mandela, wife of Nelson Mandela, Joshua Nkomo of Southern Rhodesia, who founded the Zimbabwe African People's Union, or ZAPU, and Eduardo Chivambo Monlan of Mozambique, founder and leader of the Mozambican Liberation Movement, or FRELIMO, until he was assassinated in Tanzania in 1969. So I found photos of them when they were younger. So this is Winnie Mandela. This is Joshua Nkomo. And this is Eduardo Mondlane. Other prominent liberation leaders came through Congregationalist networks, if not through the Jan Hofmeyr School. An example is in the Baningi Sitoli, a mission-educated and ordained Congregationalist minister in Southern Rhodesia, who founded Zimbabwe African National Union, or ZANU. So both of Zimbabwe's leading liberation movements were formed by people connected to Congregationalism. Sitole was later deposed as leader by Robert Mugabe while he was in prison in 1965. How did a school created by a paternalist white liberal with an apolitical agenda come to spawn this political legacy? It seems Ray Phillips did not have to train his students to be revolutionaries. He only had to equip them with a certain way of seeing the world and an understanding of social work grounded in fieldwork, for them to have the tools to interpret their social work and to advocate for political change. And testimonies from products of Jan Hofmeyr, who did not become prominent political leaders, underscore this broader sensibility. Let me cite an example from the extensive correspondence Ray Phillips maintained with his former students in the 1960s after he returned to the United States. Dr. Kenneth Dube wrote to Phillips from Kitwe, then independent Zambia, in 1966. Let me quote Kenneth Dube. There are many old Hofmeyr students in Zambia and Rhodesia. Edith is here, and I passed on your greetings. She was delighted. Esma is in Lusaka. Then there is Mambi in Salisbury, Zwiti, Mukudu, Humphrey Siganki in Lusaka. And Joshua Nkomo is at present serving his apprenticeship to a higher political position, in brackets, in detention. Jinganti is in Salisbury. Well, you see that if you were to visit Central Africa, you'll be seeing all your delinquents. I hope it will be possible for you and Mrs. Phillips to come and see for yourself the fruits of your labor. The Rhodesian situation is far from clear, but I am hopeful and believe that some justifiable settlement will be arrived at, leaving the African in their proper place. Although I think force will not be used, but something nearer to force will have to be risked. Zimbabwe will be free, and our task will be to learn not to hate. We need your help in this. Quotation closed. Ray Phillips had taught his African students that the numbers were in their favor demographically, that political power will tilt their way eventually. Their task was to be prepared for this through education. He instilled pride in the African by emphasizing his or her value. He opined that, and I quote Phillips, the African is no less valuable to the world than the gold and diamonds hidden in this great land, quotation closed. Perhaps there is no single person who prepared the ground for the multiracial democratic South Africa that would be birthed in 1994 than Ray Phillips. So let me conclude. To return to a question I asked in the introduction, what in the institutional DNA or church code of the UCC or Congregational Church explain its commitment to racial, economic, and social justice in the 1980s, and why its strong interest in South Africa? My research discovered that congregational mission activities in South Africa from the mid-19th century were paralleled by similar developments in the United States. As the American Board Mission established schools such as Amanzimtoti and Inanda Seminary in Natal in the 1850s and 60s, Congregationalists from New England and the North would head south in the United States after the Civil War to establish some 600 elementary and secondary schools to provide the newly freed slaves with an education. Out of this grew the American Missionary Society. In the 1920s and 30s, as Frederick Bridgman and Ray Phillips were actively pursuing the social gospel in Johannesburg, the United Church of Christ also established the Council for Social Action. The UCC mobilized powerfully in support of the civil rights movement and the passing of the Civil Rights Law of 1863 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Reverend Nicholas Hood, in an insightful article in Congregational Studies in 1965, sums up the congregational work for racial justice in the United States in the century up to 1965. Congregationalist emphasis on African agency and ability in their schools empowered women and men who went through their institutions in South Africa. During the 140th anniversary of Inanda Seminary in KwaZulu-Natal in 2009, keynote speaker Baleka Mbete, class of 1968, then Vice President of the Republic of South Africa, reflected on how Inanda Seminary had shaped the history of struggle in South Africa and the ANC. I quote her, "Thinking back to the 140 years of this seminary's existence is like walking through the heritage route of the liberation struggle that brought us our freedom in 1994. Ray and Dora Phillips occupy a special place in this century of congregational activity in South Africa from 1850s through the 1950s. They created and nurtured institutions and extensive social networks from the 1920s that touched many Southern Africans. Ray Phillips built bridges between the races, and he signaled possibilities that neither black nor white had imagined. Southern Africans acknowledged the inestimable debt they owed him during his lifetime and posthumously. I end with testimony from Sidney Machiki in a letter to Phillips in 1962. Machiki, a product of the Jan Hofmeyr School of Social Work, wrote from Lusaka, where he had obtained work as an assistant lecturer in the Oppenheimer College of Social Service. He noted concerning Ray Phillips, "Your name is on the lips of Africans in South Africa. People as a nation will never forget what you did for Africa. Students like Joshua Nkomo, Francis Chimbe, George Chiganti, and Simon Katilunga are staunch leaders in the political field of the Federation. In South Africa, where people are muzzled, the graduates of the school excel in the field of social work. Some are furthering their studies overseas in increasing numbers. These sentiments, expressed by many South Africans, received concrete form when in 2019, the ANC government of the Republic of South Africa under President Cyril Ramaphosa decided to award posthumously to Ray and Dora Phillips the highest national order of the country, the Order of the Baobab. Thank you for your attention.
If people would like to inquire either of our speakers.
Emmanuel, thank you. What a fascinating lecture with this original, thanks Alexa, with this original scholarship. I just want to test if I'm understanding. So you shared that there was an understanding of the Christianity of the enslaved African would maybe hang on the historical Jesus and his message of liberation, and the Christianity of the enslaver would hang on atonement and personal relationship with Jesus, as we might say now, but really more about the crucifixion, the resurrection. Would you say that the social gospel was a third thing altogether, or was it in some way the white Christian revision of its personal relationship with Jesus kind of Christology?
Okay. The social gospel, like slave Christianity, both emphasize the historical Jesus in historical time. What complicated the matter in the United States was the issue of the color of Jesus. And that became, because black theologians, black churches, James Cone, Cleach, Jotis Roberts, decided that it was kind of problematic to go to church and the cross had a white Jesus. And so it raised issues of race, especially in the 60s, when people like Malcolm X could also kind of jack the chains of the church people and say, you serve a white God. So it led to maybe 2 or 3 different trajectories. For some, Jesus was non-European, was non-Western, and that people from Palestine were not white and were not European. And you can dig in and dig in and dig in, and in the end, either you can say he's neither white nor black, or he leans closer to black. Some went that way. For some, they looked at this more not from a question of skin color, but the fact that the historical Jesus always sided with the marginalized and the vulnerable. And so if he lived in this time, that would be us African Americans. And so for them, Jesus was black, Christ was black. And so there were these different positions. The issue of color did not come into play in South Africa in the social gospel movement. And there, what seemed to be major was the kind of socioeconomic disabilities. So to be able to point to how Christ stood with the socially vulnerable and the economically vulnerable was the issue, but not the issue of whether Christ was black or not. Actually, in 1980, a branch of the UCC churches in South Africa broke away, and they created the Evangelical Federation of Christian Churches, EFCC. One of the reasons for breaking away was because they considered the regular congregational churches or the UCC churches too political. And they explicitly rejected black liberation theology. So that's a very interesting turn.
Thank you so much. I'm a longtime follower of our mission work around the world, and what has always struck me is part of what you, I believe, were saying today, and I'd like to confirm or not that this is the case. It is that the United Church of Christ and Congregationalism's mission efforts were sent abroad to with the noble cause of transforming the world. But that in fact what happened was we were transformed by our relationships with the rest of the world, because those who went out in mission, like the Phillips, maintained robust letter writing campaigns back to the churches. And yes, we made many mistakes in our attempts to be faithful. But we were really transformed by the work of the Phillips and by the witness of African Christians, Filipino Christians, Taiwanese, whoever, in their response and in our learning together. And I'm also struck by the parallels between what Dr. Andrew Young talks about when he speaks of his role in the civil rights movement and the role of the United Church of Christ in the civil rights movement in this country, and the parallels between the institutions created in South Africa and throughout Africa and the innovation of similar institutions here in the United States some years later. I believe that our work in South Africa and other places in Africa and around the world actually shaped significantly the work of the civil rights movement in creating alternative institutions in this country. And I'm wondering if that coheres with your understanding.
If I were to give a second lecture, by the time I finished writing this one, what struck me was if I had the opportunity to explore the impact of those who returned on the civil rights movement. Because I had also come to the conclusion that the influence were two ways.
If you have never been to have a conversation with Andrew Young, I strongly urge you to go as soon as possible. Because I have seen him recently and he's becoming increasingly frail, but he's the one who can help you understand that.
I will follow up on that because if anything, by the time I finished writing this lecture, I said, this was actually fun. In terms of what I learned. So maybe I will go see Andrew Young. Okay.
Maybe one more if someone has a burning question. I mean, this will be a great way to end too. Yeah.
I was just wondering, if the increase in population in the city, Johannesburg, was related to after effects of the Boer War, or did that start the influx of people into the city, or is it? Or it's all connected because this is related to the gold mining. But.
So let me come at it two ways. With the Boer War.
Mm-hmm. The second. I was thinking the second one, but.
Sorry?
I was thinking mostly of the second one, but.
Okay.
Yeah.
Black African hope was that English victory or British victory in the Boer War would be a victory for the African cause. In the end, there was rather a union of capitalist interests. And we would see even a reversal of Cape liberalism, and those who even had the vote would lose it, instead of there being an expansion of the franchise. and all united around the interest in mining. So by the time we come to the Fitz and gold mining, capitalist interest had come together. What the Nationalist Party would add, increasingly as segregation became important, was the racial element. Because there was one thing that disturbed those who were pro-apartheid. And they were around even from the 30s till they came into power. And that was the presence of poor white people. So in the 1930s, they would pass a law that, for example, on the mines, no blacks could work with machinery or equipment. You should do digging and things. Anything to do with machinery should be given to white people. And so even in terms of technology, we begin to see this even before the National Party comes to power in 1948. And so the Boer War did not have the liberatory effects that Africans had anticipated or hoped for. And then as it went, both would sort of come together. It is interesting, and then I'll stop. To do with when the people began to come to the Gamma Sigma clubs and the rest. When Ray Phillips first proposed to people at the Bantu Social Center that, I'm going to invite white people to come and speak to us. The Africans left and said, no South African white will come and speak to us. I mean, it's not going to happen. And then they started coming. And then they started coming every week and every fortnight. And then at some point in time, the black Africans will distinguish between, these are English South Africans. They are not as bad as the Afrikaner South Africans. So there are all these interesting nuances in the reception. And as far as Phillips was concerned, he just needed to open the door wide enough for them to see that there are people among the white classes who are good people. And eventually, when South Africa decided that apartheid had to end, it was these same business people and professionals who would go and start dialogue with the ANC even when the government had not gotten on that track. And so something Phillips began in the 20s and 30s will become an important part of the resolution to the crisis and the transition to democratic multiracial rule.
Thank Professor Akyeampong.